Well, here's hoping I did that right. Dorpy, dorpy, dorp, Mrs. Inglethorpe is dead. Chapter 6, The Inquest. In the interval before the inquest, Poirot was unfailing in his activity. Twice he was closeted with Mr. Wells. He also took long walks into the country. I rather resented his not taking me into his confidence, the more so as I could not in the least guess what he was driving at. It occurred to me that he might have been making inquiries at Rake's farm, so finding him out when I called at Leastway's cottage on Wednesday evening. I walked over there by the fields hoping to meet him, but there was no sign of him, and I hesitated to go right up to the farm itself. As I walked away, I met an aged rustic, who leered at me cunningly. "You from the hall, ain't you?" he asked. "Yes, I'm looking for a friend of mine whom I thought might have walked this way." "A little chap. Just waves his hands when he talks, one of them Belgies from the village." "Yes," I said eagerly. "He has been here then?" "Oh, yeah. He's been here right enough. More than once, too. Friend of yours, is he? Ah, you gentlemen from the hall. You'm a pretty lot." And he leered more jocosely than ever. Jocosely than ever. "Why do the gentlemen from the hall come here often?" I asked, as carelessly as I could. He winked at me knowingly. "One does, mister, naming no names, mind, and a very liberal gentleman, too. Oh, thank you, sir, I'm sure." I walked on sharply. Evelyn Howard had been right then, and I experienced a sharp twinge of disgust as I thought of Alfred Inglethorpe's liberality with another woman's money. Had that piquant gypsy face been at the bottom of the crime, or was it the baser mainspring of money? Probably a judicious mixture of both. On one point, Poirot seemed to have a curious obsession. He once or twice observed to me that he thought Dorcas must have made an error in fixing the time of the quarrel. He suggested to her repeatedly that it was 4:30, and not 4 o'clock when she had heard the voices. But Dorcas was unshaken. Quite an hour, or even more, had elapsed between the time when she had heard the voices and 5 o'clock, when she had taken tea to her mistress. The inquest was held on Friday at the Stylites Arms in the village. Poirot and I sat together, not being required to give evidence. The preliminaries were gone through, the jury viewed the body, and John Cavendish gave evidence of identification. Further questioned, he described his awakening in the early hours of the morning, and the circumstances of his mother's death. The medical evidence was next taken. There was a breathless hush, and every eye was fixed on the famous London specialist, who was known to be one of the greatest authorities of the day on the subject of toxicology. In a few brief words, he summed up the result of the post-mortem. Shorn of its medical phraseology and technicalities, it amounted to the fact that Mrs. Inglethorpe had met her death as the result of strychnine poisoning. Judging from the quantity recovered, she must have taken not less than 3/4 of a grain of strychnine, but probably 1 grain or slightly over. "Is it possible that she could have swallowed the poison by accident?" asked the coroner. "I should consider it very unlikely. Strychnine is not used for domestic purposes, as some poisons are, and there are restrictions placed on its sale." "Does anything in your examination lead you to determine how the poison was administered?" "No." "You arrived at Styles before Dr. Wilkins, I believe." "That is so. The motor met me just outside the lodge gates, and I hurried there as fast as I could." "Will you relate to us exactly what happened?" "I entered Mrs. Inglethorpe's room. She was at the moment in a technical tetanic convulsion. She turned towards me and gasped out, 'Alfred! Alfred!'" "Could the strychnine have been administered in Mrs. Inglethorpe's after-dinner coffee, which was taken to her by her husband?" "Possibly, but strychnine is a fairly rapid drug in its action. The symptoms appear from 1 to 2 hours after it has been swallowed. It is retarded under certain conditions, none of which, however, appear to have been present in this case. I presume Mrs. Inglethorpe took the coffee after dinner about 8 o'clock, whereas the symptoms did not manifest themselves until the early hours of the morning, which, on the face of it, points to the drug having been taken much later in the evening. Mrs. Inglethorpe was in the habit of drinking a cup of cocoa in the middle of the night. Could the strychnine have been administered in that? No, I myself took a sample of the cocoa remaining in the saucepan and had it analyzed. There was no strychnine present. I heard Poirot chuckle softly beside me. How did you know? I whispered. Listen. I should say, the doctor was continuing, that I would have been considerably surprised at any other result. Why? Simply because strychnine has an unusually bitter taste. It can be detected in a solution of 1 in 70,000 and can only be disguised by some strongly flavored substance. Cocoa would be quite powerless to mask it. One of the jury wanted to know if the same objection applied to coffee. No, coffee has a bitter taste of its own which would probably cover the taste of strychnine. Then you consider it more likely that the drug was administered in the coffee, but that for some unknown reason its action was delayed. Yes, but the cup being completely smashed, there is no possibility of analyzing its contents. This concluded Dr. Bowerstein's evidence. Dr. Wilkins corroborated it on all points. It sounded as to the possibility of suicide. He repudiated it utterly. The deceased, he said, suffered from a weak heart, but otherwise enjoyed perfect health and was of cheerful and well-balanced disposition. She would be one of the last people to take her own life. Lawrence Cavendish was next called. His evidence was quite unimportant, being a mere repetition of that of his brother. Just as he was about to step down, he paused and said rather hesitantly, I should like to make a suggestion, if I may. He glanced deprecatingly at the coroner, who replied briskly, Certainly, Mr. Cavendish. We are here to arrive at the truth of this matter and welcome anything that may lead to further elucidation. It is just an idea of mine, explained Lawrence. Of course, I may be quite wrong, but it still seems to me that my mother's death might be accounted for by natural means. How do you make that out, Mr. Cavendish? My mother, at the time of her death, and for some time before it, was taking a tonic called strychnine. Was taking a tonic containing strychnine. Ah, said the coroner. The jury looked up, interested. I believe, continued Lawrence, that there have been cases where the cumulative effect of a drug administered for some time has ended by causing death. Also, is it not possible that she may have taken an overdose of her medication by accident? This is the first we've heard of the deceased taking strychnine at the time of her death. We are much obliged to you, Mr. Cavendish. Dr. Wilkins was recalled and ridiculed the idea. What Mr. Cavendish suggests is quite impossible. Any doctor would tell you the same. Strychnine is, in a certain sense, a cumulative poison, but it would be quite impossible for it to result in sudden death in this way. There would have to be a long period of chronic symptoms, which would at once have attracted my attention. The whole thing is absurd. And the second suggestion, that Mrs. Inglethorpe may have inadvertently taken an overdose? 3 or even 4 doses would not have resulted in death. Mrs. Inglethorpe had always had an extra large amount of medicine made up at a time, as she dealt with Coots, the cash chemist in Tadminster. She would have to take nearly the whole bottle to account for the amount of strychnine found at that post-mortem. Then you consider that we may dismiss the tonic as not being in any way instrumental in causing her death. Certainly, the supposition is ridiculous. The same juryman who had interrupted before here suggested that the chemist who made up the medicine might have committed an error. That, of course, is always possible, replied the doctor. But Dorcas, who was the next witness called, dispelled even that possibility. The medicine had not been newly made up. On the contrary, Mrs. Inglethorpe had taken the last dose on the day of her death. So the question of the tonic was finally abandoned, and the coroner proceeded with his task. Having elicited from Dorcas how she had been awakened by the violent ringing of her mistress's bell, and had subsequently roused the household, he passed to the subject of the quarrel on the preceding afternoon. Dorcas's evidence on this point was substantially what Poirot and I had already heard, so I will not repeat it here. The next witness was Mary Cavendish. She stood very upright and spoke in a low, clear, and perfectly composed voice. In answer to the coroner's questions, she told how her alarm clock had aroused her at 4:30 as usual. She was dressing and when she was startled by the sound of something heavy falling. "That would have been the table by the bed," commented the coroner. "I opened my door," continued Mary, "and listened. In a few minutes a bell rang violently. Dorcas came running down and woke my husband, and we all went to my mother-in-law's room, but it was locked." The coroner interrupted her. "I really do not think we need to trouble you further on that point. We know all that can be known of the subsequent happenings. But I should be obliged if you would tell us all you overheard of the quarrel the day before." "I?" There was a faint insolence in her voice. She raised her hand and adjusted the ruffle of her lace at her neck, turning her head a little as she did so, and quite spontaneously the thought flashed across my mind. She is gaining time. "Yes, I understand," continued the coroner deliberately, "that you were sitting reading on the bench just outside the long window of the boudoir. This is so, is it not?" Excuse me, I just need to restart my chat. There we go. Hey, all right. "Yes, I understand that you were sitting reading on the bench just outside the long window of the boudoir. That is so, is it not?" This was news to me, and glancing sideways at Poirot, I fancied that it was news to him as well. There was the faintest pause, the mere hesitation of a moment before she answered, "Yes, that is so." "And the boudoir window was open, was it not?" Surely her face grew a little paler as she answered, "Yes." "Then you cannot have failed to hear the voices inside, especially as they were raised in anger. In fact, they would be more audible where you were in the hall, possibly. Will you repeat to us what you overheard of the quarrel?" "I really do not remember hearing anything. Do you mean to say that you did not hear the voices?" "Oh, yes, I heard the voices, but I did not hear what they said." A faint spot of color came back into her cheek. "I am not in the habit of listening to private conversations." The coroner persisted. "And you remember nothing at all? Nothing, Mrs. Cavendish? Not one stray word or phrase to make you realize it was a private conversation?" She paused and seemed to reflect, still outwardly as calm as ever. "Yes, I remember. Mrs. Inglethorpe said something. I do not remember exactly what. About causing scandal between husband and wife." "Ah!" The coroner leant back satisfied. "That corresponds with what Dorcas heard. But excuse me, Mrs. Cavendish, although you realized it was a private conversation, you did not move away? You remained where you were?" I caught the momentary gleam of her tawny eyes as she raised them. I felt certain that at that moment she would willingly have torn the little lawyer with his insinuations into pieces, but she replied quietly enough, "No, I was very comfortable where I was. I fixed my mind on my book." "And that is all you can tell us?" "That is all." The examination was over, though I doubted if the coroner was entirely satisfied with it. I think he suspected that Mary Cavendish could tell more if she chose. Amy Hill, shop assistant, was next called, and deposed to having sold a will form on the afternoon of the 17th to William Earle, undergardener at Styles. William Earle and Manning succeeded her, and testified to witnessing a document. Manning fixed the time at about 4:30. William was of the opinion that it was rather earlier. Cynthia Murdoch came next. She had, however, little to tell. She had known nothing of the tragedy until awakened by Mrs. Cavendish. "You did not hear the table fall?" "No, I was asleep." The coroner smiled. "A good conscience makes a sound sleeper," he observed. "Thank you, Miss Murdoch, that is all." "Miss Howard." Miss Howard produced the letter written to her by Mrs. Inglethorpe on the evening of the 17th. Poirot and I had, of course, already seen it. It added nothing to our knowledge of the tragedy. The following is a facsimile. It reads, "Styles, Court, Essex. Handwritten note. July 17th. My dear Evelyn, can we not bury the hatchet? I have found it hard to forgive the things you said against my dear husband, but I am an old woman and very fond of you. Yours affectionately, Emily Inglethorpe. Ah. It was handed to the jury, who scrutinized it attentively. I fear it does not help us much, said the coroner with a sigh. There is no mention of any events of that afternoon. Plain as a pikestaff to me, said Miss Howard shortly. It shows clearly enough that my poor old friend had just found out she'd been made a fool of. It says nothing of the kind in the letter, the coroner pointed out. No, because Emily never could bear to put herself in the wrong. But I know her. She wanted me back, but she wasn't going to own that I'd been right. She went roundabout. Most people do. Don't believe in it myself. Mr. Wills smiled faintly, so I noticed did several of the jury. Miss Howard was obviously quite a public character. Anyway, all this tomfoolery is a great waste of time, continued the lady, glancing up and down the jury disparagingly. Talk, talk, talk. When all the time we know perfectly well, the coroner interrupted her in an agony of apprehension. Thank you, Miss Howard, that is all. I fancy he breathed a sigh of relief when she complied. Then came the sensation of the day. The coroner called Albert Mace, chemist's assistant. It was our agitated young man of the pale face. In answer to the coroner's question, he explained that he was a qualified pharmacist, but had only recently come to this particular shop, as the assistant formerly there had just been called up from the army. This is taking place around World War I. These preliminaries completed, the coroner proceeded to business. Mr. Mace, have you lately sold strychnine to any unauthorized person? Yes, sir. When was this? Last Monday night. Monday? Not Tuesday? No, sir. Monday, the 16th. Will you tell us to whom you sold it? You could have heard a pin drop. Yes, sir. It was to Mr. Inglethorpe. Every eye turned simultaneously to where Alfred Inglethorpe was sitting, impassive and wooden. He started slightly as the damning words fell from the young man's lips. I half thought he was going to rise from his chair, but he remained seated, although a remarkably well-acted expression of astonishment rose on his face. You are sure of what you say? Asked the coroner sternly. Quite sure, sir. Are you in the habit of selling strychnine indiscriminately over the counter? The wretched young man wilted visibly under the coroner's frown. Oh, no, sir. Of course not. But seeing it was Mr. Inglethorpe of the Hall, I thought there was no harm in it. He said it was to poison a dog. Poison a dog? Boy, that's the end of the book. He's guilty. Poison a dog? Oh, I hate that guy. Inwardly, I sympathized. It was only human nature to endeavor to please the Hall, especially when it might result in custom being transferred from Coots to the local establishment. It is not customary for anyone purchasing poison to sign a book? Yes, sir, Mr. Inglethorpe did so. Have you got the book here? Yes, sir. It was produced, and with a few words of stern censure, the coroner dismissed the wretched Mr. Mace. The guy's name is Mace. Then, amidst the breathless silence, Alfred Inglethorpe was called. Did he realize, I wonder, how closely the halter was being drawn around his neck? The coroner went straight to the point. On Monday evening, did you purchase strychnine for the purpose of poisoning a dog? Inglethorpe replied with perfect calmness. No, I did not. There is no dog at Styles, except an outdoor sheepdog, which is in perfect health. You deny absolutely having purchased strychnine from Albert Mace on Monday last? I do. Do you also deny this? The coroner handed him the register in which his signature was inscribed. Certainly I do. The handwriting is quite different from mine. I will show you. He took an old envelope out of his pocket and wrote his name on it, handing it to the jury. It was certainly utterly dissimilar. Then what is your explanation of Mr. Mace's statement? Alfred Inglethorpe replied imperturbably, Mr. Mace must have been mistaken. The coroner hesitated for a moment and then said, Mr. Inglethorpe, as a mere matter of form, Would you mind telling us where you were on the evening of Monday, the 16th of July? Really, I cannot remember. That is absurd, Mr. Inglethorpe, said the coroner sharply. Think again. Inglethorpe shook his head. I cannot tell you. I have an idea that I was out walking. In what direction? I really can't remember. The coroner's face grew graver. Were you in company with anyone? No. Did you meet anyone on your walk? No. That is a pity, said the coroner dryly. I am to take it then that you decline to say where you were at the time that Mr. Mace positively recognized you as entering the shop to purchase strychnine. If you like to take it that way, yes. Ooh, zing. Be careful, Mr. Inglethorpe. Poirot was fidgeting nervously. Sacré, he murmured. Does this imbecile of a man want to be arrested? Inglethorpe was indeed creating a bad impression. His futile denials would not have convinced a child. The coroner, however, passed briskly to the next point, and Poirot drew a deep breath of relief. You had a discussion with your wife on Tuesday afternoon? Pardon me, interrupted Alfred Inglethorpe. You have been misinformed. I had no quarrel with my dear wife. The whole story is absolutely untrue. I was absent from the house the entire afternoon. Oh, we got a plane going overhead. Helicopter. All right. Have you anyone who can testify to that? You have my word, said Inglethorpe haughtily. The coroner did not trouble to reply. There are 2 witnesses who will swear to having heard your disagreement with Mrs. Inglethorpe. Those witnesses were mistaken. I was puzzled. The man spoke with such quiet assurance that I was staggered. I looked at Poirot. There was an expression of exultation on his face, which I could not understand. Was he at last convinced of Alfred Inglethorpe's guilt? Mr. Inglethorpe, said the coroner, you have heard your wife's dying words repeated here. Can you explain them in any way? Certainly I can. You can? It seems to me very simple. The room was dimly lit. Dr. Bauerstein is much of my height and build, and, like me, wears a beard. In the dim light, and suffering as she was, my poor wife mistook him for me. Ah, murmured Poirot to himself, but it is an idea that... You think it's true? I whispered. I do not say that, but it is truly an ingenious supposition. You read my wife's last word as an accusation, Inglethorpe was continuing. They were, on the contrary, an appeal to me. The coroner reflected a moment. Then he said, I believe, Mr. Inglethorpe, that you yourself poured out the coffee and took it to your wife that evening? I poured it out, yes, but I did not take it to her. I meant to do so, but I was told that a friend was at the hall door. So I laid down the coffee on the hall table. When I came through the hall again a few minutes later, it was gone. This statement might or might not be true, but it did not seem to me to improve matters much for Inglethorpe. In any case, he had had ample time to introduce the poison. At that point, Poirot nudged me gently, indicating 2 men who were sitting together near the door. One was a little sharp, dark, ferret-faced man. The other was tall and fair. I questioned Poirot mutely. He put his lips to my ear. Do you know who that little man is? I shook my head. That is Detective Inspector James Japp of Scotland Yard. Jimmy Japp. The other man is from Scotland Yard, too. Things are moving quickly, my friend. I stared at the 2 men intently. There was certainly nothing of the policeman about them. I should never have suspected them of being official personages. I was still staring when I startled, and I recalled by the verdict given, willful murder against some person or persons unknown. It's looking bad for Inglethorpe, man. Well, let's just keep going. Maybe we can get through another chapter here. Chapter 7, Poirot pays his debts. As we came out of the Stylites' arms, Poirot drew me aside by a gentle pressure of the arm. I understood his object. He was waiting for the Scotland Yard men. In a few moments they emerged, and Poirot at once stepped forward and accosted the shorter of the 2. I fear you do not remember me, Inspector Japp. Why, if it isn't Monsieur Poirot, cried the inspector. He turned to the other man. You've heard me speak of him, Mr. Poirot. It was in 1904 he and I worked together. The Abercrombie forgery case, you remember. He was run down in Brussels. Ah, those were great days, monsieur. Then do you remember Baron Altara? There was a pretty rogue for you. There was a pretty rogue for you. He eluded the clutches of half the police in Europe, but we nailed him in Antwerp, thanks to Monsieur Poirot here. As these friendly reminiscences were being indulged in, I drew nearer and was introduced to Detective Inspector Japp, who, in his turn, introduced us both to his companion, Superintendent Summerhay. Summerhay, I need hardly ask what you are doing here, gentlemen, remarked Poirot. Japp closed one eye knowingly. No, indeed. Pretty clear case, I should say. But Poirot answered gravely, There I differ from you. Get him, Poirot. Oh, come, said Summerhay, opening his lips for the first time. Surely the whole thing is as clear as daylight. The man's caught red-handed. How he could be such a fool beats me. But Japp was looking attentively at Poirot. Hold your fire, Summerhay, he remarked jocularly. Me and Monsieur here have met before, and there's no man's judgment I'd sooner take than his. If I'm not greatly mistaken, he's got something up his sleeve. Isn't that so, Monsieur? Poirot smiled. I have drawn certain conclusions. Yes. Summerhay was still looking rather skeptical, but Japp continued his scrutiny of Poirot. It's this way, he said. So far, we've only seen the case from the outside. That's where the Yard's at a disadvantage in a case of this kind, where the murder's only out, so to speak, after the inquest. A lot depends on being on the spot first thing, and that's where Mr. Poirot has the start of us. We shouldn't have been here as soon as this even, if it hadn't been for the fact that there was a smart doctor on the spot who gave us the tip through the coroner. But you've been on the spot from the first, and you may have picked up some little hints. From the evidence at the inquest, Mr. Inglethorpe murdered his wife as sure as I stand here, and if anyone but you hinted the contrary, I'd laugh in his face. I must say I was surprised the jury didn't bring it in willful murder against him right off. I think they would have if it hadn't been for the coroner. He seemed to be holding them back. Perhaps, though, you have a warrant for his arrest in your pocket now, suggested Poirot. A kind of wooden shudder of officialdom came down from Japp's expressive countenance. Perhaps I have, and perhaps I haven't, he remarked dryly. Poirot looked at him thoughtfully. I am very anxious, messieurs, that he should not be arrested. I dare say, observed Summerhay sarcastically. Japp was regarding Poirot with comical perplexity. Can't you go a little further, Mr. Poirot? A wink's as good as a nod from you. You've been on the spot, and the Yard doesn't want to make any mistakes, you know. Poirot nodded gravely. That is exactly what I thought. Well, I tell you this. Use your warrant. Arrest Mr. Inglethorpe, but it will bring you no kudos. The case against him will be dismissed at once. Comme ça. And he snapped his fingers expressively. Japp's face grew grave, though Summerhay gave an incredulous snort. As for me, I was literally dumb with astonishment. I could only conclude that Poirot was mad. Japp had taken out a handkerchief and was gently dabbing his brow. I daren't do it, Mr. Poirot. I'd take your word, but there's others over me who'll be asking what the devil I mean by it. Can't you give me a little more to go on? Poirot reflected a moment. It can be done, he said at last. I admit I do not wish it. It forces my hand. I would have preferred to work in the dark, just for the present, but what you say is very just. The word of a Belgian policeman whose day is past is not enough, and Alfred Inglethorpe must not be arrested. That I have sworn, as my friend Hastings here knows. See then, my good Japp, you go at once to Styles. Well, in about a half an hour, we're seeing the coroner and the doctor first. Good. Call for me in passing. The last house in the village. I will go with you. At Styles, Mr. Inglethorpe will give you, or if he refuses, as is probable, I will give you such proofs that shall satisfy you that the case against him could not possibly be sustained. Is that a bargain?" "That's a bargain," said Japp heartily. "And on behalf of the yard, I'm much obliged to you, though I'm bound to confess I can't at present see the faintest possible loophole in the evidence. But you always were a marvel. So long, so long then, monsieur." The two detectives strode away, Summerhay with an incredulous grin on his face. "Well, my friend," cried Poirot before I could get in a word, "what do you think? Mon Dieu, I had some warm moments in that court. I did not figure to myself that the man would be so pig-headed as to refuse to say anything at all. Decidedly, it was the policy of an imbecile." There are other explanations besides that of imbecility," I remarked, "for if the case against him is true, how could he defend himself except by silence?" "Why, in 1,000 ingenious ways," cried Poirot. Say that it is I have committed this murder. I can think of 7 most plausible stories, for more convincing than Mr. Inglethorpe's stony denials." I could not help laughing. "My dear Poirot, I am sure you are capable of thinking of 70. But seriously, in spite of what I heard you say to the detectives, you surely still cannot believe in the possibility of Alfred Inglethorpe's innocence." "Why not now as much as before? Nothing has changed. But the evidence is so conclusive." "Yes, too conclusive." We turned in at the gate of Leastways College and proceeded up the now familiar stairs. Yes, too conclusive," continued Poirot almost to himself. "Real evidence is usually vague and unsatisfactory. It has to be examined, sifted. But here the whole thing is cut and dried. No, my friend, this evidence has been very, very cleverly manufactured. So cleverly that it has defeated its own ends." "How do you make that out?" "Because so long as the evidence against him was vague and intangible, it was very hard to disprove. But in his anxiety, the criminal has drawn the net so closely that one cut will set Inglethorpe free." I was silent, and in a minute or two Poirot continued. Let us look at the matter like this. Here is a man, let us say, who sets out to poison his wife. He has lived by his wits, as the saying goes. Presumably, therefore, he has some wits. He is not altogether a fool. Well, how does he set about it? He goes boldly to the village chemist and purchases strychnine under his own name, with a trumped-up story about a dog which is bound to be proved absurd. He does not employ the poison that night. No, he waits until he has a violent quarrel with her, of which the whole household is cognizant, and which naturally directs their suspicions upon him. He prepares no defense, no shadow of an alibi, yet he knows the chemist assistant must necessarily come forward with the facts. Bah! Do not ask me to believe that any man could be so idiotic. Only a lunatic who wished to commit suicide by causing himself to be hanged would act so. Still, I do not see, I began. Neither do I see. I tell you, mon ami, it puzzles me. Me, Hercule Poirot. But if you believe him innocent, how do you explain his buying the strychnine? Very simply. He did not buy it. But Mace recognized him. I beg your pardon. He saw a man with a black beard like Mr. Inglethorpe's, and wearing glasses like Mr. Inglethorpe, and dressed in Mr. Inglethorpe's rather noticeable clothes. He could not recognize a man whom he had probably only seen in the distance, since, you remember, he himself had only been in the village a fortnight, and Mrs. Inglethorpe dealt principally with Coots and Tadminster. Then you think, mon ami, do you remember the 2 points I laid stress upon? Leave the first one for the moment. What was the second? The important fact that Alfred Inglethorpe wears peculiar clothes, has a black beard, and uses glasses, I quoted. Exactly. Now suppose anyone wished to pass himself off as John or Lawrence Cavendish. Would it be easy? No, I said thoughtfully. Of course, an actor, but Poirot cut me short ruthlessly. And why would it not be easy? I will tell you, my friend, because they are both clean-shaven men. To make up successfully as one of these two in broad daylight, it would need an actor of genius and a certain initial facial resemblance. But in the case of Alfred Inglethorpe, all that is changed. His clothes, his beard, the glasses with which he hides his eyes, those are the salient points about his personal appearance. Now, what is the first instinct of the criminal? To divert suspicion from himself, is it not so? And how can he best do that? By throwing it on someone else. In this instance, there was a man ready to his hand. Everybody was predisposed to believe in Mr. Inglethorpe's guilt. It was a foregone conclusion that he would have been suspected. But to make it a sheriff thing, there must be tangible proof, such as the actual buying of the poison, and that, with a man of the peculiar appearance of Mr. Inglethorpe, was not difficult. Remember, this young Mace had never actually spoken to Mr. Inglethorpe. How should he doubt that the man in his clothes with the beard and his glasses was not Alfred Inglethorpe? Yeah, it may be so, I said, fascinated by Poirot's eloquence. But if that was the case, why does he not say where he was at 6 o'clock on Monday evening? Ah, why indeed, said Poirot, calming down. If he were arrested, he probably would speak, but I do not want it to come to that. I must make him see the gravity of his position. There is, of course, something discreditable behind his silence. If he did not murder his wife, he is, nevertheless, a scoundrel and has something of his own to conceal, quite apart from the murder. What can it be? I mused, won over to Poirot's views for the moment, although still retaining a faint conviction that the obvious deduction was the correct one. Can you not guess? Asked Poirot, smiling. No, can you? Oh, yes, I had a little idea some time ago, and it has turned out to be correct. You never told me, I said reproachfully. Poirot spread out his hands apologetically. Pardon me, mon ami. You are not precisely sympathetic. Sympathique. Good one. He turned to me earnestly. Tell me, you see now that he must not be arrested. Perhaps, I said doubtfully, for I was really quite indifferent to the fate of Alfred Inglethorpe, and thought a good fright would do him no harm. Poirot, who was watching me intently, gave a sigh. Come, my friend, he said, changing the subject. Apart from Mr. Inglethorpe, how did the evidence at the inquest strike you? Pretty much what I expected. Did nothing strike you as peculiar about it? My thoughts flew to Mary Cavendish, and I hedged. In what way? Well, Mr. Lawrence Cavendish evidence, for instance. I was relieved. Oh, Lawrence. No, I don't think so. He's always a nervous chap. His suggestion that his mother might have been poisoned accidentally by the means of a tonic that she was taking, that did not strike you as strange, huh? No, I cannot say that it did. The doctors ridiculed it, of course, but it was quite a natural suggestion for a layman to make. But Monsieur Laurent is not a layman. You told me yourself that he had started by studying medicine and that he had taken his degree. Yes, that's true. I never thought of that. I was rather startled. It is odd. Poirot nodded. From the first, his behavior has been peculiar. Of all the household, he alone would be likely to recognize the symptoms of strychnine poisoning. And yet we find him the only member of the family to uphold strenuously the theory of death from natural causes. If it had been Monsieur John, I could have understood it. He has no technical knowledge and is by nature unimaginative. But Monsieur Laurent, no. And now, today, he puts forward a suggestion that he himself must have known was ridicule. There is food for thought in this, mon ami. It's very confusing, I agreed. Then there is Mrs. Cavendish, continued Poirot. That's another who is not telling all she knows. What do you make of her attitude? I don't know what to make of it. It seems inconceivable that she should be shielding Alfred Inglethorpe, yet that is what it looks like. Poirot nodded reflectively. Yes, it is queer. One thing is certain. She overheard a good deal more of that private conversation than she is willing to admit. And yet she is the last person who would accuse of stooping to eavesdrop. Exactly. One thing her evidence has shown me. I made a mistake. Dorcas was quite right. The quarrel did take place earlier in the afternoon. About 4 o'clock, as she said. I looked at him curiously. I had never understood his insistence on the point. Yes, a good deal that was peculiar came out today, continued Poirot. Dr. Bauerstein, now, what was he doing up and dressed at that hour in the morning? It is astonishing to me that no one commented on this fact. He has insomnia, I believe, I said doubtfully, which is a very good or a very bad explanation, remarked Poirot. It covers everything and explains nothing. I shall keep my eye on our clever Dr. Bauerstein. Any more faults to find with the evidence? I inquired satirically. Mon ami, replied Poirot gravely, when you find that people are not telling the truth, look out. Now, unless I am much mistaken, at the inquest today only one, at most 2 persons, were speaking the truth without reservation or subterfuge. Oh, come now, Poirot. I won't cite Lawrence or Mrs. Cavendish, but there's John and Miss Howard. Surely they were speaking the truth. Both of them, my friend. One, I grant you, but both. His words gave me an unpleasant shock. Miss Howard's evidence, unimportant as it was, had been given in such a downright straightforward manner that it had never occurred to me to doubt her sincerity. Still, I had great respect for Poirot's sagacity? Wow. Except on the occasions when he was what I described to myself as foolishly pig-headed. Do you really think so? I asked. Miss Howard has always seemed to be so essentially honest, almost uncomfortably so. Poirot gave me a curious look, which I could not quite fathom. He seemed to speak, and then checked himself. Miss Murdoch, too, I continued. There's nothing untruthful about her. No, but it was strange that she never heard a sound sleeping next door. Whereas Mrs. Cavendish, in the other wing of the building, distinctly heard the table fall. I wonder if Cynthia was drugged. Well, she's young, and she sleeps soundly. Ah, yes, indeed. She must be a famous sleeper, that one. I did not quite like the tone of his voice, but at that moment a smart knock reached our ears, and looking out of the window we perceived the 2 detectives waiting for us below. Poirot seized his hat, gave a ferocious twist to his mustache, and carefully brushing an imaginary speck of dust from his sleeve, motioned me to precede him down the stairs. There we joined the detectives and set out for Styles. I think the appearance of the 2 Scotland Yard men was rather a shock, especially to John, though of course after the verdict he had realized that it was only a matter of time. Still, the presence of the detectives brought the truth home to him more than anything else could have done. Poirot had conferred with Japp in a low tone on the way up, and it was the latter functionary. Poirot had conferred with Japp in a low tone on the way up, and it was the latter functionary who requested that the household, with the exception of the servants, should be assembled together in the drawing-room. I realized the significance of this. It was up to Poirot to make his boast good. Personally, I was not sanguine. I don't know how to say that word. Poirot might have excellent reasons for his belief in Inglethorpe's innocence, but a man of the type of Summerhay would require tangible proofs, and these I doubted if Poirot could supply. Before very long we had all trooped into the drawing-room, the door of which Japp closed. Poirot politely set chairs for everyone. The Scotland Yard men were the cynosure of all eyes. I think that for the first time we realized that the thing was not a bad dream, but a tangible reality. We had read of such things. Now we ourselves were actors in the drama. Tomorrow the daily papers, all over England, would blazon out the news in staring headlines. Mysterious tragedy in Essex. Wealthy lady poisoned. Dun, dun, dun. There would be pictures of Styles, snapshots of the family leaving the inquest. The village photographer had not been idle. All the things that had that one had read 100 times, things that happened to other people, not to oneself. And now in this house, a murder had been committed. In front of us were the detectives in charge of the case. The well-known glib phraseology passed rapidly through my mind in the interval before Poirot opened the proceedings. I think everyone was a little surprised that it should be he and not one of the official detectives who took the initiative. "Mesdames and messieurs," said Poirot, bowing as though he were a celebrity about to deliver a lecture, "I have asked you to come here all together for a certain object. That object, it concerns Alfred Inglethorpe." Inglethorpe was sitting a little by himself, I think, unconsciously. Everyone had drawn his chair slightly away from him, and he gave a faint start as Poirot pronounced his name. "Mr. Inglethorpe," said Poirot, addressing him directly, "a very dark shadow is resting on this house. The shadow of murder." Inglethorpe shook his head sadly. "My poor wife," he murmured. "Poor Emily. It is terrible." "I do not think, monsieur," said Poirot pointedly, "that you quite realize how terrible it may be for you." And as Inglethorpe did not appear to understand, he added, "Mr. Inglethorpe, you are standing in very grave danger." The two detectives fidgeted. I saw the official caution, "Anything you say will be used in evidence against you," actually hovering on Summerhay's lips. Poirot went on, "Do you understand now, monsieur?" "No. What do you mean?" "I mean," said Poirot deliberately, "that you are suspected of poisoning your wife." A little gasp ran around the circle at this plain speaking. "Good heavens!" cried Inglethorpe, starting up. "What a monstrous idea! I poison my dearest Emily!" "I do not think," Poirot watched him narrowly, "that you quite realize the unfavorable nature of your evidence at the inquest. Mr. Inglethorpe, knowing what I have now told you, do you still refuse to say where you were at 6 o'clock on Monday afternoon?" With a groan, Alfred Inglethorpe sat down again and buried his face in his hands. Poirot approached and stood over him. "Speak!" he cried menacingly. With an effort, Inglethorpe raised his face from his hands. Then, slowly and deliberately, he shook his head. "You will not speak?" "No, I do not believe that anyone could be so monstrous as to accuse me of what you say." Poirot nodded thoughtfully, like a man whose mind is made up. "Soit," he said, "then I must speak for you." Alfred Inglethorpe sprang up again. "You? How can you speak? You do not know—" And he broke off abruptly. Poirot turned to face us. "Mesdames and messieurs, I speak. Listen, I, Hercule Poirot, affirm that the man who entered the chemist's shop and purchased strychnine at 6 o'clock on Monday last was not Mr. Inglethorpe. For at 6 o'clock on that day, Mr. Inglethorpe was escorting Mrs. Raikes back to her house from a neighboring farm. I can produce no less than 5 witnesses to swear to have seen them together, either at 6 or just after, and, as you may know, the Abbey farm, Mrs. Raikes' home, is at least 2.5 miles distant from the village. There is absolutely no question as to the alibi." Poirot going to bat for Inglethorpe, who seems like kind of a stiff idiot, or a man of method. He's been called both. But anyway, we will pick up chapter 8 tomorrow. I'd love to keep reading, but my voice is getting thin. Like I said before, my schedule is Sunday through Thursday at 9 p.m. Pacific time. So thanks for stopping by, and the replay of this reading will be live on Instagram in just a few minutes, and we'll have a link attached if you wanted to donate to Everyday Action, which donates leftover food from movie, TV, and commercial sets to those in need around LA and other cities, I believe. But anyway, look for that. If you got a buck or two you can give, that'd be great. If not, maybe you'd like to share the read with others who might want to donate. However you want to help, but at the end of the day, you don't have to do anything but enjoy yourself. So have a good evening, and I'll see you tomorrow at 9 o'clock. Bye-bye.